1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1 through 8. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, of the mountains of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. The man went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to Yahweh of hosts in Shiloh. Also the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of Yahweh, were there. And whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although Yahweh had closed her womb. And her rival also provoked her severely, to make her miserable because Yahweh had closed her womb. So it was year by year, when she went up to the house of Yahweh, that she provoked her. Therefore she wept, and did not eat. Then Elkanah her husband said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why don't you eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? This is the word of the Lord. So, what's going on here in this passage? First verse, we see Elkanah introduced, and his introduction gives us a hint about some things we want to pay attention to while we look through this book. First, his introduction reminds us of Manoah in Judges chapter 13, verse 2. Manoah is Samson's father. This is a little hint that we're going to want to pay attention to the story of Samuel and Samson and kind of compare and contrast them. They were likely contemporaries, probably born about the same time, ministered about the same time, though in different places. They were co-laborers in ministry after a fashion. This first verse is also reminiscent to the introduction to Micah in Judges chapter 17, verse 1, and also the certain Levite, aka Moses' grandson, in Judges chapter 19, verse 1. This sets the scene for another theme that Judges closes with, and we'll see particularly highlighted in the early chapters of Samuel, that of priestly corruption at the highest levels. Like Elimelech in the book of Ruth and his descendant David, Elkanah is also an Ephrathite. That's probably a better translation than Ephraimite there in verse 1. Which brings us to the second question here. Is he an Ephraimite or a Levite? According to 1 Chronicles chapter 6, Elkanah is actually a descendant of Levi's son Kohath. So they were responsible, the Kohathites were responsible for taking care of certain parts of the temple furniture and stuff. So they were Levites, not Ephraimites. This family was probably stationed in Ephraim because the Levites, remember, they did not get their own tribal inheritance, but rather were spread throughout the rest of Israel. They were given their own cities, and they were responsible for not only leading Israel in worship as priests, but also for teaching the law of God to all of Israel. What does Elkanah's name mean? Probably means something like God has taken possession. In verse 2, Hannah and Peninnah are introduced. Hannah's name probably means something like favor. Peninnah's name probably means something like pearls. Hannah's name will be particularly significant as she is praying and asking to find favor with the Lord. In verse 3, we see that Elkanah goes up to the Lord, goes up to Shiloh to visit the tabernacle there every year, which means he was at least moderately faithful among the Israelites. This is particularly significant when you consider the priestly corruption, as well as the hatred of the worship of God that this brought on among a lot of Israelites. God here is called Yahweh of hosts. This is the first time we see this name for God in Scripture, and this is probably intended to help Israel remember, even though they are under the oppression of the Philistines at this time, they have been brutally treated by many enemies, particularly during the time of the Judges. They're to remember they're God's army. They're supposed to be following His orders, and God will give them victory if they simply obey Him. That's one of the big lessons of the first 7 chapters of the book of Samuel. We also are introduced here in verse 3 to the name Phinehas, one of Eli's sons. This ought to start ringing a bell for us because Phinehas we've seen that name before. Numbers 25, right? Remember that story where right after you have Balaam try to curse Israel and then goes home without his money and without the favor of Balak, the king of Moab. They get the idea, instead of trying to curse Israel, let's try to corrupt Israel. Let's send in pretty ladies to tempt Israelite men away from the worship of Yahweh and towards the worship of false gods, a tactic which works fabulously. And then you have a Israelite prince takes a Moabite princess and brings her in and basically says, hey y'all, watch this. And he takes her into his tent in the sight of all Israel. And Phinehas, a priest, goes in, takes a spear, and stabs them both through while they're in the act of getting busy. And God gives Phinehas a great big attaboy and says, you just stopped the plague. You saved Israel here. This is particularly ironic because, as we'll see later, that Phinehas would probably have stabbed this Phinehas through for the sort of shenanigans that he got up to.